There's a certain kind of quiet that only shows up on perfect summer afternoons. The kind where the air feels warm but lazy, the water in your pool barely ripples, and the only sound is the soft clink of ice in a glass of lemonade sitting beside you. That was the kind of afternoon I was having, floating on my back, eyes half closed, letting the sun do its thing while the neighborhood sat peacefully around me like a postcard nobody had bothered to ruin yet. For a few minutes, it felt like owning a small piece of paradise. Then the shadow appeared. Not a cloud, not a bird, a person. I opened one eye just in time to see the unmistakable silhouette standing outside my backyard gate. Wide sun hat, clipboard tucked under one arm like it was a badge of authority. Lips pursed in that familiar expression that always seemed to suggest the world wasn't following enough rules. Karen. She leaned slightly toward the fence, peering in at the pool like an appraiser inspecting stolen treasure. "Nice pool," she said sweetly, tapping the clipboard. Then her smile tightened. "You know, the HOA board has been discussing something. Some people feel it's only fair that everyone in the neighborhood should be able to use it." I blinked, water dripping from my eyelashes. "Otherwise," she added calmly, "we may have to require that it be shut down." For a moment, I honestly thought I'd misheard her. The water around me barely moved as I lowered my feet to the pool floor and looked toward the gate again, trying to figure out if this was a joke that just hadn't landed yet. Karen, however, wasn't smiling the way people do when they're kidding. Her expression had that polished seriousness people wear when they believe they're delivering a public service. "It's about fairness," she continued, tapping the clipboard with the tip of her pen like she was punctuating a courtroom argument. "Your pool is the only one in the community. Some residents feel it creates inequality." I stared at her for a second, letting the word float there between us. "Inequality," I repeated slowly. "You mean because I built a pool in my own backyard?" Karen gave a patient sigh, the kind adults use when explaining obvious things to stubborn children. "The HOA board has a responsibility to maintain harmony in the neighborhood. When one household has amenities that others can't reasonably access, it can create division." "So the solution," I said, "is that everyone gets to use my pool?" "Either that," she replied smoothly, "or the board may consider requiring that it be closed." I let out a short laugh that surprised even me. "Unless the HOA paid for my pool," I said. "I'm pretty sure that's not how private property works." Karen's smile didn't move an inch. "You'll receive a formal notice soon," she said. "Then we'll see what the rules say." 2 days later, an official envelope from the HOA appeared in my mailbox. I'll be honest, when I first opened that letter, my stomach did a small, unpleasant flip. Official envelopes have a way of doing that. The language inside didn't help either. It was full of phrases like community equity, shared access expectations, and the ever-popular failure to comply may result in escalating consequences. It sounded important, serious, and just vague enough to make a person wonder if they were about to lose an argument they didn't even know they were having. But once the initial irritation settled, something else took its place. Curiosity. Because here's the thing about rules. If someone is waving them around like a weapon, there's usually a very specific place they're hiding. And if you look long enough, you tend to find out whether that weapon is real or just made of paper. So that night I pulled up the HOA charter. Then the bylaws. Then the amendments. What started as a quick check turned into a full-blown research session. Highlighter in one hand, coffee in the other. Scrolling through pages that read like the world's driest legal novel. Landscaping standards, fence heights, paint color restrictions, page after page of rules designed to keep suburban life neat, orderly, and occasionally ridiculous. At first, nothing about pools. Then I found it. Buried halfway through a section labeled recreational structures was a clause so clear it almost felt personal. The HOA could not regulate or restrict privately built recreational amenities unless they were funded by association dues. My pool wasn't, not a single tile. And suddenly Karen's big threat didn't look powerful anymore. It looked reckless. Once I realized Karen's threat had no real legal footing, the irritation I'd been carrying around started to turn into something else entirely. Confidence. Not the loud, chest-puffing kind, but the quiet kind that shows up when you know the rules better than the person trying to use them against you. I could have ignored her. That probably would have been the simplest move. But something about the whole situation made me want to be very clear. So instead of sending a long email or arguing at the gate again, I did something much simpler. I ordered a sign. Not a flimsy plastic yard sign either. I'm talking about a professionally engraved aluminum plaque, clean lettering, polished finish, the kind of sign that looks like it belongs on the door of a law office. When it arrived, I bolted it right beside the pool gate where anyone walking past could see it. It read, "Private property, not affiliated with HOA use. Trespassers subject to enforcement." See HOA Charter Section 8.3.2. Simple, direct, impossible to misinterpret. Karen noticed it the same afternoon. I was watering a few plants when she marched up to the fence, eyes locked on the plaque like it had personally insulted her. "This is incredibly divisive," she snapped, gesturing at the sign. "You're creating unnecessary tension in the neighborhood." I set the hose down and walked over, trying not to smile too much. "No," I said calmly. "I'm just following the rules." Then I tapped the last line of the sign. "Section 8.3.2, I added. "You might want to read it." Karen didn't respond right away, but the way her eyes narrowed told me the conversation wasn't finished. People like her rarely walk away from a challenge. They regroup. They look for another angle. Sure enough, the next week proved it. The first notice arrived on a Monday morning. According to the HOA, my front lawn was a quarter-inch above the recommended height. Not illegal exactly, just borderline non-compliant. The second complaint showed up 2 days later, this one about the color of my mailbox post. Apparently, the shade of black I'd used was slightly outside the approved palette. By the third notice about a decorative light near my driveway, the pattern was obvious. Karen had changed tactics. If she couldn't control the pool directly, she was going to make life just annoying enough that I'd eventually cave. The strategy was petty, but I had to admit it was clever in a small, irritating way. Death by paperwork. At first, I handled each complaint quietly, fixing nothing and responding politely. But the real turning point came during a casual conversation with Mark, the quiet guy who lived 3 houses down. When I mentioned Karen's sudden interest in my lawn, he laughed in a tired sort of way. "Oh," he said, "you're on her list now." That's when the story started. The couple across the street had been fined over the height of a bird feeder. Another neighbor got warnings about the angle of their patio umbrella. Someone else had received 3 letters about the placement of a garden statue. Suddenly, the situation didn't feel personal anymore. It felt familiar. And that realization changed everything. Because if Karen had been doing this to half the neighborhood, then maybe the problem wasn't my pool. Maybe the problem was Karen. Once you start hearing enough similar stories, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Karen hadn't just been strict. She'd been building a reputation one complaint at a time. And the more neighbors talked, the clearer it became that a lot of people had quietly accepted it simply because no one had challenged her before. That changed during a conversation with Mark one evening while we stood near the sidewalk watching his kids ride their bikes in slow circles. Out of curiosity, I asked, "How does someone actually stop a board member from doing all this?" Mark shrugged. "You vote them out." That was the moment everything shifted. It turned out Karen's HOA board position was up for re-election in just a couple of months. I hadn't even known elections were that regular, but apparently they happened every year. Normally, nobody paid much attention. A handful of ballots, a quiet confirmation, and the same people stayed in charge. But this year suddenly felt different. "Would you ever run?" I asked. Mark laughed at first, the way people do when they assume you're joking. But the more we talked, the less ridiculous the idea sounded. He'd actually served on the board once before, long before Karen's clipboard empire started growing. More importantly, people trusted him. Over the next few weeks, the conversation spread quietly across driveways and backyard fences. Nothing dramatic, no loud campaigning, just neighbors comparing notes, realizing they weren't the only ones frustrated. Karen must have sensed something shifting. She still walked the neighborhood with the same confident posture, clipboard tucked under her arm, smile fixed in place. But confidence looks a little different when fewer people smile back. Election day arrived with far less drama than you might expect, but the tension in the air was impossible to miss. Neighbors who normally rushed through the clubhouse parking lot suddenly lingered a little longer, chatting quietly while ballots were dropped into a simple plastic box on a folding table. Karen was there early, standing near the entrance with her usual polished smile, greeting people as if nothing had changed. But something had. When the votes were finally counted that evening, the result wasn't even close. Mark won by a wide margin, the kind of margin that sends a very clear message without anyone needing to say it out loud. Karen gathered her papers quickly and left before the small crowd inside the clubhouse had even finished clapping. The new board didn't waste time. One of their first motions clarified a rule that should have been obvious from the beginning. The HOA would not interfere with privately owned amenities that were legally built and privately funded. In other words, my pool was officially none of their business. A week later, I hosted a small get-together by the water. Nothing flashy. Just a few neighbors, cold drinks, and the quiet satisfaction of a problem that had finally settled itself. Before the evening ended, I added one last touch to the front yard. A small decorative garden sign positioned just right so it faced the street. It simply read, "Private means private." Now I'm curious. Do you think Karen got exactly what she deserved? Let me know below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this.